register the morning of at the golf course. If you want to get started, Tina Cordova, the floor is yours. It'll be the New Mexico Downwinders continue the fight for justice.
Thank you, Vanessa. I appreciate the introduction. I want to also thank Julie for putting these talks together and for inviting me to participate again. That's wonderful, Julie. And I just want to also say that I'm a proud graduate of New Mexico Highlands University and always give credit to the university for the education that I was able to receive there. I want to also acknowledge a couple of people who I see in the group of people who have joined. Theodora. Hi, Theodora. I look forward to talking to you soon about your project. Thanks for joining today. And then I would be remiss if I didn't recognize Dr. Alberto Padilla, who's in Florida, and one of my classmates from Highlands. Nice to see you there, Alberto. So today—
Same here, Tina. Thank you so much.
Wish you were in person, Alberto. So I'm planning to speak today about an issue relevant to the people of New Mexico, an issue that basically we've been living with for 77 years. And many of you are new to the subject matter, I'm sure. So I'm going to give a little bit of background information, and then I'm going to talk about where we're at today with expanding what's called the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act to include the people of New Mexico. My name is Tina Cordova. I'm the co-founder of an organization called the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium, or TBDC for short. We're a 17-year-old organization that's been working to bring attention to the negative health effects suffered by the people of New Mexico as a result of their overexposure to radiation from the Trinity test. Unbeknownst to most people, we were not just downwind of the Trinity test, we were also downwind of the Nevada test that took place. There were over 100 of those that took place in Nevada. It's well documented that through the summer of 1962, we were exposed to those tests as well. And then Trinity is not the only nuclear test that took place in New Mexico. There was actually a test in May of 1945 in advance of Trinity called the 100-ton test. That test was specifically developed to take a look at what would happen with fallout. It was laced with nuclear material. And they did trace the fallout from the 100-ton test, and it did go to many parts of New Mexico. And then we were also subject to two what were called plowshares tests. Those were nuclear tests that took place in the 70s, one in the Four Corners area near Farmington, where they buried a nuclear device 4,000 feet underground to basically bring up natural gas. It did that, but the natural gas was laced with radiation and therefore unusable. And then there was another test done, that was called Gas Buggy. There was another test done near Carlsbad called Nome. I'm certain, although I don't know this for sure, I'm pretty certain they conducted that test to see what would happen if there was a nuclear disaster, basically in advance of establishing WIP in that area. So the people of New Mexico have been overexposed to radiation for a very long time. We also, just as a matter of fact, were long ago declared a sacrifice zone. We have the cradle to grave process taking place in New Mexico. The cradle is the opening up of the earth and the extraction of uranium. Along the Navajo Nation, Laguna and Acoma Pueblo, we have over 1,000 abandoned uranium mines and milling sites. They extracted 32 million tons of uranium from the earth here and abandoned those mines. Just to give you perspective on that, if you've ever been to the pit in Albuquerque where the Lobos play basketball, when they built the pit, they extracted 50 tons of dirt to establish the pit. So that'll give you a perspective of what 32 million tons might look like. And so the uranium workers also were exposed to radiation, and actually those people still live adjacent to the tailings, the mountains of tailings that have been abandoned by our government in these native lands. I recently had a chance to travel to Laguna Pueblo and visited a village called Powati. Powati is the site of the Jackpile mine. It's the largest open pit uranium mine in the world. And what amazed me and troubled me very deeply is that when I stood on the mesa above where the village of Pewati is, I was less than half a mile from the Jackpile mine. And you could see what was normal landscape because it was the normal New Mexico landscape with vegetation growing. And then you could tell what were tailings because there were these mountains of uranium tailings that took on an ugly yellow hue and not much grew on them. So people are still living adjacent to these tailing sites, and they're all Superfund sites that have never been abated by our government. So we still are being exposed to radiation through that process. And then the grave, we have the testing and development and testing of nuclear devices here. And just for the sake of accuracy, at the beginning of our nuclear, in the beginning of developing nuclear devices, we dumped nuclear waste into the canyons, or they dumped nuclear waste into the canyons around Los Alamos Labs. And that obviously became part of the watershed that fed the Rio Grande. So that's part of the development and what took place with nuclear waste then. And then we test nuclear devices here. I've already described that. And then New Mexico is the only site for a permanent repository. That's the waste isolation pilot plant where they store low-level waste. But we're under consideration right now for a high-level waste facility that will be called Holtec. They will be bringing in spent plutonium rods from nuclear power plants from all across the country along rail cars, and they'll be storing it here. It's called an interim site, but because we don't have a permanent site designated any place, I can only tell you that an interim site may end up being a permanent site. And so we should all in New Mexico be very concerned about the Holtec site. Getting back to the Trinity test and why I have organized to stand up for the people of New Mexico, there's a couple of things I want to stress about Trinity very quickly. Number one, it was the first test of a nuclear device. The people of New Mexico were the first people exposed to radiation as a result of a detonation any place in the world. What the government fully knew in 1945 is that radiation was dangerous to human health. That was already well established. The other thing they actually fully knew is that the bomb was going to create fallout. What they didn't know is how much plutonium was necessary for the actual detonation of the device. So they overpacked the bomb with 13 pounds of weapons-grade plutonium that has a half-life of 24,000 years. Only 3 pounds of plutonium were necessary for the fission process. So a full 10 pounds of the most toxic substance known to man went up in a fireball that exceeded the atmosphere. It went over 40,000 feet high, exceeded the atmosphere, penetrated the stratosphere, and then rained down as a radioactive ash on the communities surrounding Trinity. Our government said then, continues to say today, that the area was remote and uninhabited. But we know, because a brilliant student at UNM took on a project for me about a year and a half ago, where he took the 1940 census data, overlaid that on a map of New Mexico, and then drew radiuses around Trinity at 10-mile increments to 150 miles. What we know is that nobody lived in a 10-mile radius. At 20 miles, there were about 121 people. At 50 miles, there were 15,000 children, women, and men living adjacent to the test site. At 150 miles, it encompassed Albuquerque and Santa Fe to the north, El Paso and Ciudad Juarez to the south, and we're talking about 500,000 people. So it was not remote and it was not inhabited. The other thing we know about Trinity is that when you place a bomb on a platform 100 feet off the ground, it does not produce destruction, it produces massive fallout. And the government never repeated a test like Trinity. They never tested a bomb on a platform 100 feet off the ground. They never overpacked a bomb with plutonium again. The other thing that's important to know about Trinity that's relative to exposure is that in 1945, we didn't have running water in most of the communities surrounding Trinity. In all parts of rural New Mexico, we were devoid of running water. So what that meant is we relied on the rain that fell from the sky, and we collected it in cisterns. It was collected in holding ponds. Obviously, it would have been charging up our lakes, our rivers, our creeks, and our acequias, our ditch systems. The little town I'm from, Tularosa, has the largest ditch system in New Mexico. Obviously, people were very much relied on these sources, the rain that fell from the sky, as their source of water. Let me just say that once you get radiation in a contained vessel like a cistern, a lot of times these were lined with either metal or some kind of plaster. Once you get radiation inside of a cistern like that, it's going to remain there forevermore. And so their water source was completely affected. We didn't have electricity, so we didn't have refrigeration, which meant that there were no grocery stores. So we had mercantile stores, and what you bought at a mercantile store was flour, sugar, rice, cereal, coffee, but you didn't buy dairy, you didn't buy any kind of meat, and you didn't buy produce. All of those things were produced by your own means at your home. So in the little town I was from, there were 3 active dairies, but people had their own milk cows and goats. They raised beef, sheep, pigs, chickens, for the purpose of protein. And then we hunted a great deal. People still hunt all over New Mexico. We're in the middle of our hunting season right now. And we all had gardens. We produced our own produce, and we relied on the local dairies. Well, I don't have to tell you, but as that ash fell from the sky, obviously our complete food source was now affected. There's 3 modes for being exposed to radiation. That's through inhalation. As the ash fell from the sky, obviously people would have been inhaling the smallest particles of radiation, and now that's in people's lungs. The other mode is ingestion. I just described to you how people would have been very overexposed through their water and their food source. And then the last one is absorption through your skin. If you don't have running water, the fact is you don't bathe as often. So if you got radiation in the ash that fell from the sky on your scalp or on your skin, it likely stayed there for many days until you were able to bathe and wash it off. So it's well established that through the process of detonating Trinity so close to where people lived, their lives were forever affected. I like to say that we were the collateral damage of the Trinity test, always unacknowledged and never assisted with what happened to us. There's never been an epidemiological study of what took place in New Mexico, and our government has, for the most part, just walked away. So what has that meant for the people in New Mexico? Well, first of all, in my own family, I'm the 4th generation to have cancer since 1945. I had 2 great-grandfathers that lived in Tularosa at the time. 10 years later, in 1955, they were both diagnosed with what was called stomach cancer. They were sent to El Paso for a diagnosis. They were told that they had stomach cancer. They were given morphine, and they were sent home to die. There was no treatment for anybody in 1945, and no one had ever heard the word cancer. My mom always talks about how she didn't like visiting her grandfather because she thought it was something you could actually catch from somebody else. Both my grandmothers had cancer. My father died after having 3 different cancers, 2 of them primarily that he did not have risk factors for, except that he was a 4-year-old child consuming mass quantities of cow's milk in the little town that he grew up in at the time of Trinity. My dad developed a primary tumor at the base of his tongue that had to be removed. He had to go through extensive radiation. He was on a feeding tube for over 18 months. It robbed him of his health, but somehow he survived. Then he got prostate cancer, which was a walk in the park in comparison to the first cancer diagnosis. And then 8 years after the first cancer, he developed another primary tumor at the forward part of his tongue, not related to the first tumor. That was known on a cellular level. They were different. And when I asked the doctors here, how is it that he would get something like this when he didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't use chewing tobacco, had no viruses? And they said, we don't know, but it's very common in New Mexico. And then when I was 39 years old, I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer. And the first question they asked me was, when were you exposed to radiation? And I said, well, I grew up in a community about 45 miles the way the crows fly from the Trinity test site. I would suppose that might have been my exposure. My family history is a serious cancer history. My sisters had cancer. My mom's being followed for a tumor right now. And that's a serious family history. But I can tell you that we have documented hundreds of families that have had worse cancer histories than my own throughout the state of New Mexico. We've collected over 1,000 health surveys from people documenting their own history and then their own family's history. And there are some very devastating histories out there. The other thing that I want to tell you guys that happened after the test in 1945 is that we had a spike in infant mortality after a 10-year decline associated with the advent of antibiotics and better hygienic practices. We went from something like 30 babies per 1,000 dying in New Mexico to over 100 babies per 1,000 in the months directly after Trinity. Our babies were dying. And I always say we had casualties from Trinity and they were our babies. And if you're not upset by that, you should be. It's the most egregious part of the story, that our government looked the other way. They were contacted by a healthcare worker in New Mexico who alerted them to the fact that children were dying, and the government decided to deny, deflect, and assume no responsibility, nor give any helpful tips on what we could have done to save babies. We're doing a deep dive into this, and we think the numbers are actually very understated. Babies in 1945 were not born in hospitals or medical facilities. They were born at home, delivered by doulas or midwives. Many times their births were not recorded, much less their deaths. And we've been cross-referencing death certificates to church records that we've been accessing. And what we're finding is that there are a lot more babies that died, and church records document that, when we don't have actual death certificates to verify. So we're doing a deep dive into that, and that's something that I think everybody should be concerned about, because the government has never addressed the infant mortality in New Mexico after the Trinity test. This has had a horrible negative economic impact on the people of New Mexico. As I travel, and I have done so throughout the state, not only in downwinder areas, but also on native lands where they did uranium mining. The story I hear is something like this: I had a good job, I had a retirement. My wife and I were so looking forward to the day that I could retire, and we were saving up for that. We fully expected to help our kids go to college, but I always had this nagging pain in my abdomen. I finally made my way to a doctor in Las Cruces, a gastroenterologist. They ran some tests. They told me I had stage 4 colon cancer and sent me to El Paso for treatment. I tried to maintain my job and also go for treatments 4 times a week, and pretty soon I couldn't keep it up. I lost my job. I've spent all my retirement and all the equity in my house on co-payments, co-insurance, deductibles, medications, etc. I've maxed out 3 credit cards, and now my kids are sending me Visa gift cards so I can buy gas to get to and from my treatments. Most days I wish I would die so I wouldn't be a financial burden to my family anymore. And I just think that this is the most horrible thing I've ever been through. I'll never help a child go to college. We can't generate any kind of generational wealth when we live with this kind of burden. And I hear this story repeated over and over about people's lives as they become sick later in life. And let me just tell you, it has had a huge economic impact, in that when we've been doing our health survey, one of the questions that we ask is, how are you accessing health care? New Mexico is the state most dependent on Medicaid any place in the country. 47% of all people in New Mexico access health care through Medicaid. One of the questions on our health survey is, how do you access health care? And inevitably, people always list Medicaid and Medicare. So we know that a lot of people in New Mexico using that system are on Medicaid, and thank goodness for the system, because if not, I guess people would just be dying in the streets. So where are we at today? We found out during the time that we've been working on this over the last 17 years that there was a fund set up in 1990, so 32 years ago, called the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, or RECA, that's been taking care of downwinders of the Nevada test site. As an example, they take care of people in Winslow, Arizona, 259 miles from the Nevada test site, but they don't take care of the ranchers and the people who live as close as 12 miles to the Trinity test site. That fund has paid out $2.5 billion over 32 years to about 38,000 claimants. It includes those people who mined uranium before 1971, because in 1971, uranium became commercially available, and the government decided that they would leave it up to industry to take care of people when they're harmed. Industry has not done a very good job of taking care of people, and we have this whole group of miners and uranium workers who worked after 1971 that have not received a dime in assistance. So we have been working for many years now to try to get passage of amendments to RECA that would include compensation or restitution. It's not compensation. We did not sign up to do this work. We were enlisted into service without consent or knowledge. It pays out restitution, and we have been trying to be included in the fund. There have been bills entered for 11 years. Right now, we're closer than we've ever been before, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But it would actually, the bills that are introduced in Congress today would actually extend a one-time payment of partial restitution of $150,000 to claimants who qualify. It would extend healthcare coverage to those who need it, and it would establish what are called radiation exposure screening and education program clinics throughout our state where people could go annually to be screened for cancer. All of this actually generates its own economy. And as an example, for those people who live in the Four Corners area and qualify for RECA as a uranium miner who worked before 1971, there are all sorts of businesses established there that cater to that segment of the population. They supply everything from walkers and oxygen to home health care, etc. It generates its own economy. It would be positive for the economy of New Mexico. And as an example, as I travel and speak to mayors and town councils all across New Mexico, one of the things I always tell them is if only 100 people in your community apply to the program and are accepted, that would bring $15 million into your community. And I always say, when's the last time $15 million came to Carrizozo or San Antonio or Socorro? And they always say never. And so it does generate a positive economic impact for communities, and it would do so for the state of New Mexico. And we would shift people off of Medicaid onto RECA healthcare coverage, which is the best healthcare coverage available any place in the world. So right now, it would pass in the House of Representatives if they brought it forward for a vote. We're waiting on the Congressional Budget Office to score the bill. We're being told that it's very likely going to cost a lot of money. I don't know what a lot of money is. What I can tell you is that we spend $50 billion annually maintaining our nuclear arsenal. That's not building one new plutonium pit. That's not assembling one new nuclear device. That's simply putting what we now currently have to bed every night. $50 billion a year for that process. And so we continue to say that it's not going to cost too much to add us. In this fight, we're also fighting to add places like Guam, where they did testing in between testing in New Mexico and testing in Nevada. They tested in the Pacific Islands. The people of Guam have never been taken care of. And we're fighting to add all the other states where we know that fallout went from Nevada. And those states are states like Idaho, Montana, all of Arizona, all of Colorado, all of Utah, all of New Mexico. And so it would also add the post-71 uranium miners. So it would pass in the House tomorrow. It has passed out of the House Judiciary Committee, but we need to reach 60 votes in the US Senate. And we believe that right now we're at something like 54 votes. We believe that we have all the votes of all the Democrats and everybody who caucuses with Democrats. And we have 4 Republican signers and co-signers to the bill in the US Senate. And so we're focusing in on US Senator Daines from Montana, who has affected constituents, the 2 US Senators from Utah, Romney and Lee, who have affected constituents, the 2 US Senators from Texas, Cornyn and Cruz, who have affected constituents because Texas was the second leading producer of uranium behind New Mexico. And we're fighting every day for that. And so people often ask me in New Mexico, how can we get involved? What can we do? And I always say, reach out to our members of Congress, let them know this is vitally important to you as a member of, the populace in New Mexico. They need to hear that. They're all 5 behind this. All 5 of our members of Congress are either signers or co-signers to the bill, in the bills in the House and the Senate. And so in our state, we have the we have the luxury of knowing that all 5 of our members of Congress support. And then I always tell people, everybody has family and friends in other places. You can reach out to your family and friends in other states and let them know that this is an issue of concern for you. It's a matter of social justice and environmental justice. I was in a meeting recently with Senator Sass's staff from Nebraska, and there was a gentleman on the call with us from Nebraska who's working in Nebraska on our behalf. And he told Senator Sass's staff something really kind of profound. He said, look, here in Nebraska, where I'm from, when you break something, you take responsibility for it and you fix it. And he said, I want Senator Sass to sign on to this because we broke these people's lives. We changed their lives forever, and we broke their lives. And I think we're responsible for fixing them. And that's why I'm standing with them. And so that sort of gives you an idea of the history. I know I've spoken for probably close to 30 minutes now, and I've given you a lot of information, and I'm certain that there's probably some questions that somebody might want to ask, or there might be comments that somebody might wants to add. Every time I speak, somebody inevitably does come forward with their own personal family history. We're standing up for all the people of New Mexico. It's just not those people that lived right adjacent to Trinity, but everybody, because everybody in New Mexico is downwind of something. So just so you know, if you've never considered yourself a downwinder, after hearing this today, you should consider yourself a downwinder if you live here. So I'll stop there and ask if anybody has any questions.
Hello, Tina.
Yes, Mr. Garcia.
Good to see you again. So thank you for taking on this very important issue. I thought that I used to take on difficult issues. So this has obviously been a long-term thing since the beginning of the Manhattan Project. And thankfully, there's some kind of a government program in place. So now your efforts are trying to get people into that program, because undoubtedly litigation would be out of the question. So you're doing more of a legal, political, congressional effort?
That's a very good question. And let me tell you why. Because the genesis of the compensation program through our government was legal. We had Stuart Udall, who was the Secretary of the Interior when he retired. He went back to Utah, and he was being approached by all these people with their stories of being overexposed to radiation. So he filed lawsuits, and the lawsuits were making their way through the court, and he was successful. But at every level, they were saying that it was in the interest of national security to conduct the tests, and so they would not award damages. What's amazing is he made it all the way to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, and his son, former Senator Udall, told me this story himself. He worked on the cases with his dad, and he said his dad told him that at the Supreme Court, they would get the same outcome, so they weren't going to spend any more money on a legal route. And he made a trip to DC and met with then Senator Orrin Hatch, who has now passed away, and Senator Ted Kennedy also, who has passed away. And he convinced them that they needed to come up with some kind of reparations for the people who were affected by this. And so that's how the program started. Now, you mentioned a potential legal route, and there might be one, Mr. Garcia. We're not going to completely dismiss that idea, because statute of limitations prohibits us from doing anything this late. But we were not, the infant mortality was only brought to our attention within the last few years. And so there still may be a possibility to file lawsuits on behalf of the babies and the babies that died and the families that lost babies. So that's not out of, that's really not out of the line of thinking that we have taken most recently. We're still exploring what happened, and we may seek legal remedy for that.
And yes, we're all downwinders even today. I live in northeastern San Miguel County, but Los Alamos. If anything were to happen there, you know, the wind is prevailing from the west and it goes towards Las Vegas. So, you know, everybody's still in some kind of potential danger.
That's absolutely true. And when you think about the half-life of some of the, you know, like the plutonium as an example, it has an exceedingly long half-life. And once it's part of our environment, it's very difficult to separate that and believe that it's gone. It's likely not gone and likely never going to be gone. And it's going to be here forever. And we live in an arid climate. And out there on the White Sands Missile Range where the Trinity site is located, they continue to detonate devices out there to this day. I mean, they continue to detonate all sorts of devices and test all sorts of devices out there to this day. And I have always brought up the idea of resuspension of particulate matter, because when they detonate something and they disturb that dry soil and the sandy, dry soil that we have out there, they could very easily be resuspending anything that became part of the landscape back in 1945. And that's concerning to me. But you're absolutely right. And just something to sort of align with what you're saying about where you live. During those years right after the Manhattan Project, right after the Trinity test, the government was taking possession of organs from people at autopsy in the state of New Mexico. And the highest levels of plutonium ever recorded on autopsy from anyone here was from a lady in Truchas. And that's quite a ways from Trinity. But of course, she's adjacent to, not too far from Los Alamos. So there's no way to know for certain what her exposure was or how she was exposed, but she was, and she had the highest levels of plutonium in her liver ever recorded on autopsy.
Well, how are they taking possession of organs of dead people?
They did whatever they wanted, Mr. Garcia. They did whatever they wanted, and they basically just said that it was in the interest of national security. There's a long record of that. Let me tell you, the Geiger counters went off the charts in Carrizozo the day of Trinity. And they told the men that were physically there with the Geiger counters to leave because it was no longer safe to be there. But they did not evacuate a single person. And just also as a matter of history, they lined up cattle trucks outside of Carrizozo to potentially evacuate people, cattle trucks. We have a rail system that goes through Carrizozo. And every time I think about that, I think about how little concern they had for human health, number one, and for the fact that we were human beings, so much so that they were going to take people out of there in cattle trucks where there was no seating. There was no place for people to be seated. One of my very closest friends was born 8 days before the Trinity test in Carrizozo. So I always visualize her mom and her dad loading her up into a cattle truck and being taken out of there on a dirt road. There was nothing but dirt roads leading into Carrizozo. But they had no concern for us as human beings, so much so they didn't even arrange rail cars to maybe take us out of there.
Well, that's what they did. They always choose desolate, isolated places with low population. And then they look at also the kind of people that are living there and their economic situation, the socioeconomic situation, and that's why they picked that area. So it's not just us, it's the Native Americans, put onto reservations and then, treated. I was surprised that you said that there's that much tailings in the reservations. That is astonishing.
Yep, it's astonishing. But most of the people all across the world that have been affected by nuclear testing, by the testing of nuclear devices, they look a lot like you and I. They're people of color. It's the Kazakhstani people, the people in Australia, the Aborigines. So this is a pattern. But one of the things I will say, the United States is also the only country that tested on its own mainland nuclear devices. So this has not been the best part of our history. And the fact that American citizens were harmed, especially children, is unconscionable. Are there any other questions, comments, concerns? Any questions I might be able to answer?
So who's working with you? I think you're the Tina from the construction company in Albuquerque. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Who else is working with you? Who else is helping you on this immense project?
Well, we have a steering committee. We actually have a structure to all of this. We have a steering committee. We meet every Monday night. I cooperate with a variety of other organizations throughout New Mexico. We've received grant funding and we've completed a health impact assessment. I mean, we have some really deep, we're deep functioning. We have a lot going on. We work with a lot of organizations throughout New Mexico that are concerned with nuclear issues and concerned with environmental justice, etc. But I also work as part of a national coalition that we formed about 2 years ago now. We call it the Frontline Coalition. There's members there from the Pacific Islands, Idaho, Utah, Arizona, the Navajo Nation, Laguna, and Acoma Pueblo. And we actually are the ones that wrote the language in the bills that have been introduced recently. We work very closely also with the members of our congressional delegation, primarily Senator Lujan, and very much so with Representative Ledger Fernandez. And I work with also a lot of different national organizations that are concerned with environmental justice. And so there's a lot of depth to what we're doing, and we do partner with a lot of organizations. And I will be honest with you, I participate in lobbying calls many, many times each week.
So you're working with Representative Fernandez. She's a great asset. I've been working with her for the last 6 months or so, and she's very in tune, she's very involved, and she's very effective. What about Deb Holland?
So let me just say first, I have the highest regard for Representative Ledger Fernandez, and she's a Downwinder. When I first met her and told her about this, she said that she had gotten cancer at the same time, that there were 5 members of her family that all had cancer at the same time, and she said she's the only one that was surviving. And we found out that as we talked about her family history, we found out that her family members were in areas that would have been highly affected by the fallout. She recently, as an example, got a meeting for us with Secretary Becerra from Health and Human Services, and we had a great meeting with him. We asked him to elevate this to the level of the White House and the president, and he told us that he would work on that. It's amazing. Secretary Holland was a big supporter of ours when she was in Congress, but we haven't been able to get her attention as of recently. And having her attention would be very important. She's from Laguna Pueblo, by the way. She literally spent time there with, I understand, her grandparents, probably not too far from that large open pit mine I discussed earlier. She was very supportive as a congresswoman, but we haven't been able to get her attention. If anyone knows how to reach her, we'd love to hear about it. Because when we got Secretary Becerra's attention last week, it was out in the national news. And that's the kind of attention we need to gather.
Well, I hope you can do that soon. I know she's overwhelmed and she's busy because she's new. And so hopefully somebody can make contact with her and bring this up to the limelight again.
It's an issue that truly does affect the Native people. And as you know, the head of the Interior Department, most of that falls under her jurisdiction. And so I'm very, very hopeful that soon, because she's had a lot of big issues to tackle, I'm hoping that soon she'll have time to give some attention to this issue.
Tina, this is Alberto. I don't know if you can hear me okay, but I mean, this issue, I mean, we're talking about a half-life of 24,000 years. This is something that's going to affect people for a long, long time. And you can't put behind history. And there's a lot of examples. I mean, and I agree with your comment and the comment Mr. Garcia had, affecting minorities, you know, populations of color. Well, let's compare to just a disease that it's not too frequent in populations of Native Americans or Hispanics, like cystic fibrosis. And yet, for something that is a minimal percentage of affected Caucasians, there's a lot of money for that. There's a lot of money for research for trying to solve a problem that affects, I believe, about 1 in 17,000 or so. I'm sorry, 1 in about 2,500 Caucasians. So there is an issue there. It's hard for me to believe, but it's hard not to think and compare to other projects that get a lot of money to solve problems, when we can right now, even we have the technology to eradicate genetic diseases, but we're not going to be able to eradicate those 24,000 years of half-life of plutonium.
That's a wonderful observation. And you know what else I would love for you to maybe just speak to, because I know you know this inside and out, Alberto, but there's also a genetic component to being exposed to radiation. And I know there's science on both sides of this, but you and I have discussed this in the past. And I always say, how is it that radiation affects all the other cells in your body, and there's scientists that believe it doesn't somehow affect also your genetic material? So if you don't mind, I mean, if you'd like to take a quick stab at the effects of radiation to genetics, it's not going to go away. And we do see this as being multi-generational. And the people of New Mexico are going to deal with this for a very long time, if not forever. I mean, 24,000, somebody recently told me a half-life of 24,000 years is 7,000 generations. There's no end to that.
Yes, and that's exactly it. I mean, it's from my point of view, there's no way that you could say that radiation doesn't affect your DNA, and your DNA is your genetics. I mean, DNA is breaking apart and repairing as we speak thousands of times in every single cell of the almost 100 trillion cells that we have in our body. Now, let's just think about something. We use ultraviolet radiation, which is nothing compared to plutonium-239, okay? And that actually kills bacteria. We know that we use it as a means to disinfect even water. So radiation and the magnitude of what you're speaking about, for me, it's absolutely impossible to say that there is no effect in that DNA. And there is hundreds of thousands of publications that will tell you that radiation at much lower levels have an effect, especially in people who are preconditioned from familial genetic diseases.
Absolutely. And one other thing that I want to sort of touch upon, because we have just a little more time. Everybody saw that in New Mexico on the Navajo Nation, we had a very difficult outcome, a devastating outcome with COVID. And at the beginning of the outbreak of the pandemic, we wrote a letter to Congress. I told everybody, we're going to see a terrible outcome amongst downwinders and uranium workers with this virus, because these people have underlying lung disease, they have underlying health issues, they're cancer survivors, they're not going to fare well, their immune systems are compromised, and we're going to have devastating consequences. And sure enough, that's what we saw. And you know, somebody was telling me, when we wrote a letter to Congress and we said, please pay attention to what we're saying here, because we know that in our communities, we're going to have devastating consequences. And somebody said, well, you know, on the Navajo Nation, there's still lots of areas where they don't have running water or electricity. Did that have an effect? And I said, that may have had an effect on infection rates, the rates of infection, but that certainly should not have had an effect on their outcome. Now, lack of access to healthcare also is a factor, but there again, that's something that our government should be addressing when they know that you have a cohort, a population that is susceptible, and they paid no attention to us. They paid absolutely no attention to the letter that we wrote predicting what was going to happen. And at one time, the Navajo Nation had the highest death rate of any place in the country per capita. And when I talked to my friends there, they said these were all ex-uranium workers. These were people who had survived cancer and couldn't overcome the virus.
So DNA mutations by radiation is well known, and they're running into that problem in space. You know, there's two brothers that are space astronauts. One of them stayed up there for a year, and they tested his blood, and his DNA has been altered fundamentally in comparison to his brother. So, and those aren't the type of radiations like plutonium and stuff. Those are more like neutrons and photons and other types of radiation. So radiation does affect our DNA. There's no doubt about it.
Are there any other questions, comments, concerns? Theodora, do you have any thoughts that you want to share? Okay. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, yeah, maybe. So yeah, I'm artist and PhD candidate, and I'm working on the imprint of the nuclear research in the Four Corners area, and I'm especially interested in the idea of like internal colonialism and how nuclear research was linked with capitalism and extractivism and everything. So so this is a PhD, so there's a written part, but there's also a film, sculpture, and video. So I'm in Las Vegas, New Mexico for 2 months, and I arrived 10 days ago, and I'm like conducting the project here.
Welcome to New Mexico.
New Mexico is one of the most beautiful states that we have here in the United States. I gotta say that every time I listen to Tina, I learn something. And I mean, I've read a lot of stuff about what she publishes and what her group does. And every time it's just an incredible story, and it's a lesson to me. And it should be a lesson to every New Mexican as well. And I'm not a born New Mexican. I'm actually from Florida, but I spent many years in New Mexico. I love the state of New Mexico. I went to Highlands University. I was Tina's classmate. Tina, I always tell her she was the brightest of all of us. And I always learn a lot, and it really attracts me to be part of this, of her group. And every time I think about it, it's about what, 75 years since this catastrophe happened. It's brutal. It's really brutal. We would have called it genocide a long time ago, and we're pretty much biting our tongues. We wouldn't accept this in any other foreign country, and yet we have the problem here, right here in the United States. So Tina, you do an amazing job. I learn from you all the time. Thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you, Alberto. I'm glad you were able to join today. And for those of you who are interested, please weigh in on the Holtec site, storage site that's under consideration right now. Our governor, the state legislature, our attorney general, just about everybody is against it. And you know, they're moving forward with this without any regard for what the people think about it here. And what I always say in regards to this is that they're going to tell us it's safe, and seemingly it is right up until the moment it's not. And then it's catastrophic and no one comes back. And I can attest to that because we've been waiting 77 years. And our children deserve better than this. We should not become the nuclear dumping ground for the rest of the United States. We don't see the benefit of the power that's generated in these power plants, and it is not our job to assume responsibility for this waste. I don't know where or how long ago they decided we were a sacrifice zone, but it's time for us to say no longer. I really do believe that at one point they counted on us to be unsophisticated, uneducated, and unable to stand up for ourselves, but we're not those people any longer. And so I would encourage all of you who have listened today and have become motivated to do, if you've become motivated to do anything, please contact your members of Congress and let them know that you're not in favor of Holtec. Contact the governor's office so that she remains strongly against Holtec. And we just can't let these things go on any longer. They cannot go unchallenged. It's our job to challenge. It's that saying, when you know something's wrong and you see that it's wrong, you have to stand up. Otherwise, you're complicit. You become complicit in the problem. So I thank you all today. for joining. And I'm going to put my email address in the chat in case anyone wants to email me and find out more. And I'll also put our website, because there's so much information there. You'll find everything that you'll ever want to know about the work that we're doing. But just in case it's www.trinitydownwinders.com. In case anybody wants to go there, I would encourage you to go there and read the family histories that are placed there, because some of them are just profound and hard to believe, actually. Hard to believe. There was a time when they freely let people go in and out of Trinity. And they took children out there on field trips and fed them. And we're getting ready to go out there again on October 15th for their open house. They open it twice a year, and they sort of convey to people that it's safe to be out there. And we just stage ourselves outside the gate, and we say, if you're going to, if you're going to over sensationalize the science and industry, then we're going to place ourselves here, so you have to see us and acknowledge us as you go in there. And somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 people go out there each time they open it. And there's people that come from all over the world. It's truly insane, because there's really nothing out there to see. But there'll be 6,000 visitors there. So if anybody wants to join us, we'll be at the Stallion Gate on Highway 380 from about 9 in the morning till about 2 in the afternoon for a peaceful demonstration, just greeting everybody that goes through that gate and passing out our information.
Well, it's all about money. So even Nevada turned them down. Nevada has a lot of nuclear waste. And finally, a few years ago, they told them no more nuclear waste. So they're trying to bring it to New Mexico now. So they're trying to sell it as, this is money for New Mexico. These are jobs for New Mexico. Well, we don't want that kind of money, and we don't want those kind of jobs.
At the end of the day, Mr. Garcia, it's never that many jobs. It's a pretty static industry. And at the end of the day, they sell it on the idea. But at some point you have to say, what's more important, money or our lives, and the lives of our children and our grandchildren? And so for me, there's not enough money out there for us to say, yeah, go ahead and bring all the high level waste that you guys can possibly bring on rail cars, no less. You know what our infrastructure is like in this country. And all you have to do is open the newspaper every now and then, and there's train cars derailed all over New Mexico. And not only that, but let me say this. If there is a terrorist out there that wants to cause a huge problem for us in this country, all they have to do is figure out how to get those casks to breach. And they can do that, I don't know, around Los Angeles or Chicago or New York or Santa Fe. And they breach one of those casks, and they're going to cause a major, major nuclear disaster that we cannot clean up, that there will be no cleanup for. Thank you all.
Thank you, Tina, for taking the time today. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Have a good day, everybody. Happy homecoming.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, Alberto.